Hello, Alexandre. Thank you so much for being with us today to discuss about your music, what you do, and to teach us about your instrument, the viola.
Thank you for having me. It is my pleasure to be here today.
So, Alexandre, tell us what's in the program for today and what is it that you do?
Absolutely. I am a teaching artist. I teach strings in Boston and its surrounding areas. I'm mainly teaching a lot these days. I am a violist, therefore, I play the viola, and that is the medium that I use to express artistically. I have created a varied program of contrasting music and styles. When we refer to classical music, we're talking about a vast variety of music. This term is just a generalization to what we also know to be as Western music or written music. In order to introduce the viola, which is the main instrument that I play and that I perform, it's best to start with the Baroque era.
That is wonderful. And what is the Baroque era? What can you tell us about it, or what should we try to listen for?
Absolutely. The Baroque era. Well, first of all, it would be great to define a little bit what this term means because we often hear it in the humanities or in history classes, but we do not know where the word comes from. This word comes from the Portuguese and it means misshapen pearl. So a little bit of a disfigured pearl, and that's where the term comes from. When it comes to music, this era or time period begins in the 1700 approximately. So that means we're talking about the 1600s. And it extends for a period of 150 years, culminating with the death of one of the most important composers who has ever lived, which is Mr. Johann Sebastian Bach, who dies in 1750, and that marks the end of the Baroque era in music history. The Baroque can be perceived visually as a period of tremendous wealth. It is also known as a time when the church had a lot of power. And what this means is that they held absolutely all the power that there was. This is the reason why this time frame is also referred to as the absolutism era, because the church made all of the decisions concerning government and other institutions. It is highly associated also with the counter reformation of the Catholic Church. If we want to get a visual reference of what the Baroque era looks like when it comes to a physical representation, perhaps we could talk about architecture during this time period. By doing so, we could maybe explore what the constructions of the great Italian architect Gian Lorenzo Bernini looks like. His architecture was characterized mainly by a desire to explore a great contrast and massive ornamentations, which are very typical of this era.
This is all very fascinating. Could you tell us more about the structures of the era and how these tendencies became so prevalent?
Absolutely. We could travel from Bernini, from the way of architecture, all the way to the realm of literature, where if we study some of the most important works ever written during this time frame, perhaps if we take a look at Don Quixote, written by Don Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, published in two different editions. So we have an early one, which is the first part of the book, which is published in 1605, and then a second one in 1615. Don Quixote becomes in itself one of the most important examples of Baroque literature and also all the themes that this era particularly wants to explore. In the second part of Don Quixote, we start seeing a lot of exaggerations in the character, how the characters are described, their ugliness, their features. Again, these are not real characters. It's a huge exaggeration from what we know is reality. Now, this is very typical of this time frame. So if we think of literature, if we think of Bernini in architecture, we're thinking about pieces of work in different realms that associate through this very vast exaggeration. So when we talk more about Don Quixote, precisely, we could talk about the ugliness and the grotesque, which is very present and prevalent in the literature of this era, oftentimes called feísmo in Spanish, or also in English as ugliness. And these are some of the important traditions within the Baroque if we want to think of imagery. So all the scenes are very theatrical, and the themes are oftentimes curious about exploring death. So when we think of martyrs, for instance, um, again, these are truly reflected throughout the novel, which I recommend very much to everyone that likes to read. There are also traces of tenebrism. So people and writers were artists in general were seeking to explore the darkness of life and other topics that were maybe and still are today considered to be taboos. So I'd say that there is just a lot of dramatic contrast. Don Quixote is starting to go out at night instead of during the daytime, and that is a way of entering this world of obscurity.
This is all very interesting, Alexandre. And tell me something. How does it relate to the music you are playing for us today?
Absolutely. Well, this chiaro oscuro, which is the term oftentimes used during the era, again, Don Quixote coming out at night instead of coming out during the daytime, is very prevalent in Baroque music. So in the program, I will be interpreting the Telemann Viola concerto. This piece was written in four movements. The shape of it is slow, fast, slow, fast. So it's a very typical structure during the time. It was written circa 1716 and 1721. It's in the key of G major, but the third movement it's written in the relative minor key, in the sister key of G major. So it's a sadder movement. I've chosen this piece by George Philipp Telemann, who was a German composer, because he's one of the first musicians to really give the viola a role of importance. We could say a solo role. This German composer was extremely prolific during his time, and it's through this work that the viola first gets acknowledged as a solo instrument, and it showcases it's a very good example of its solo and expression capacities.
So, this is a question I've been wanting to ask you. How is the viola any different from the violin or the cello?
Absolutely. Well, they obviously belong to the same family. So what changes here is the tessitura. Tessitura is an Italian word that means range. So if we think of a choir where you have sopranos, where you have altos, where you have tenors, and where you have basses, that's how we could categorize the strings family. We could say the violins are the sopranos of the strings family. The violas become the altos of the string family. And actually, in French, the word viola is alto because it refers directly to its tessitura. So then we have the cellos, which are the tenors, and then the double basses, which are the basses. So that's how we could understand the difference between these instruments. The viola is in the middle range of the strings family.
And tell me something. How can we hear the Baroque tendencies in the piece you'll be playing for us today?
Absolutely. So again, it all comes back to the chiaroscuro, which is such an important technique of contrast, dark and night and day, for instance, in music. Since this is not a pictorial way of expression, we are creating something out of the abstract, out of sound. There is nothing truly more abstract than sound itself. So the way musicians use this effect is through the use of musical dynamics, through the scope of dynamics. So what are dynamics? Dynamics are the degrees of loudness or softness that a musician can use, either playing an instrument or singing, even just to show difference in the music, contrast in the music. We refer to these as piano and forte, which are the musical terms, which just translates from Italian to soft and loud. In early recordings of musicians that really try to capture the true spirit of this music and the time frame when it was written, you would see that they really strive to showcase two shades of the sound, which is the light and the dark in music. Nowadays, interpreters, myself included, they try to find a more romantic approach where the music becomes a little more expressive and not confined to just two different dynamics. You can hear also in the structure of the music itself, in the sections that are repetitive, how the music asks, it requires for an echo effect where you have a difference in the second time. So things don't sound as monotonous as they would if you just played them with the same degree of sound. We also take many different freedoms in the scope of hermeneutics, in the scope of interpretation. So we add, as Baroque music interpreters, our own decorations. So when we talked of Bernini, we talked about decorated churches. As musicians, we decorate our music, we create our own ornaments, which is one of the best artistic devices that we can use and that we have the most fun utilizing. In this edition that I'm playing, you'll hear my own ornamentations, my own decorations, as well as a cadenza or little improvisation at the end of the first movement that it's also a composition of my own. Aside from this, you will hear the basso continuo, which is a standardized bass line during the time frame, which is very defining of what Baroque music sounds, and it's usually underneath the accompanimental textures.
Great. Let's hear it.